Good evening to everybody. Marcus Notaro, winemaker here at Stag Wine Cellars, and I want to welcome you to our second of our 5-part seminar series where we are celebrating our 50th anniversary of the winery. So today I'm going to go across and kind of talk to you about the history and the style with our top wine that we produce here at this estate, Cask 23. But before I get into that, we have something else to celebrate today, and that is the opening of our tasting room again. So starting today, we're open Thursday to Monday. We could not be happier or more excited to be hosting and having people back on our property to enjoy our wines. You know, it's a great place to be. It's a great place to visit. We have lots of outdoor spaces, and you know, I'm up here every day, and you know, I started making the wines here in 2013. And I remember asking my assistant winemaker now, Luis Contreras, who's worked here for decades. I'm like, Luis, do you ever get tired of looking up at these Palisades, up at these mountains when you come to work here? And he's like, Marcos, I never get tired of it. And I never get tired of it either. It's a great place to come enjoy wines. We've got lots of spots to host you. It is a little different in that you do need to make an appointment. So either give us a call, check us out on the website, make sure you go to the right Stag's Leap Wine Cellars, and we look forward to hosting you here. So real quick too, before we go into the wine tasting, and if you have something in front of you, please be sure you open up that bottle up, whatever wine that you have. Maybe it's a bottle of Cask, maybe it's a bottle of Sauvignon Blanc. Please open that bottle up. And if you have questions as we go, whether it's about Cask 23 or about the wines that you have in front of you, or about some of the things that I'll share with you, remember there's that button down there on the bottom where you can ask a question, and I'll try to get through as many of those as we can. But we started last time talking a little bit about the vineyards and what was happening outside. So we've had a pretty warm week since last week, and we are very busy in the vineyards basically doing what's called leaf stripping now. So the berries are set. I showed you what the berry set, the flowering looks like, and the set. And now what we're actively doing is exposing those grapes to the sunlight. So on the cooler sides of the canopy, you can see all of the clusters right now. And on the warmer sides of the canopies, you may be able to see them. We want a little bit of shading. But what I actually thought it'd be interesting to show you two different clusters, because last week I showed you what, grapevines like to grow. And the other thing that we're looking for right now is their sign, how happy they are in terms of water. Are they actively growing? And if you recall, I grabbed the shoot tip, and when the tendrils were really growing far past the edge, that meant the vine was happy, right? And then I showed you another one where the tendrils were smaller, the leaves, the nodes were much shorter together, and that was a vine that wasn't as happy. So what I want right now, though, the grapes themselves are doing what's called cell division. So the individual berries are subdividing between themselves. So the importance from what I was talking to you about last week is that the happier the plant is at this stage, the more the little berries are going to divide and become larger. The more stressed the vine is, the berries are going to become smaller. So that's where it becomes very important in a dry year versus a wet year, and it's definitely going to pertain to the two wines that we're going to taste later on. So I grabbed these two clusters for you to see. These are both from SLV Block 4, so our old 1972 planting. These vines are no more than 10 vines apart, but this vine is being grown in a much more rockier soil, so you can see how much smaller the berries are here. Versus this vine, this is actually from an end vine. So the end vines tend to get a little bit more water. They don't have more nutrients, but just to show you the real comparison as to what happy vines, especially at this time of the year, it's a really critical time. And also for me as a winemaker, gives me some clues, right? That's why in a year like this, if I know that we had a dry season going in, I'm potentially gonna wind up with more tannic or more powerful wines later on down the road. Okay, so let's talk about Cask. And again, if you're just joining now, my name is Marcus Notaro. I'm the winemaker here at Stag Wine Cellars. If you have questions, there's a button on the bottom where you can pop into them. And there should also be a place where we do have some library vintages of Cask 23 available right now through our wine shop. I think we have 2008, 9, and 10, and then a little bit of the 2014, which we're going to taste here in a second. But the story of Cask. So Cask 23 started, our first vintage was in 1974. So at this time, a man named Andrei Telechev, who was a very famous consultant, helped out a lot of folks in the Napa Valley and other wine regions as well. He was consulting here with Warren Vernarski, and basically Warren and Andrei were tasting through the cellar And actually, it is the historic cellar that the inside of it was different at that point, but this is the cellar. We're tasting through all of the barrels or casks of SLV, and they came across one that they thought the quality was so superior that it had to be bottled on its own. So they bottled it and then named it after the cask or the barrel number that it was being aged in. So it was being aged in barrel number 23 or cask number 23, and that's where the wine got its name. So then from the beginning, up until 1990, when cask 23 was bottled, then it would have been just the finest expression of SLV. Last week, I talked a lot about SLV, what makes it so special, that young red volcanic soil, its personality, you know, those current, the firm, the rich tannins that don't tend to be too over the top, and the incredible ageability. Up until 1990, it would have been like the top wine from SLV for that particular vintage. But starting in 1990, Cask 23 changed. So in the mid 80s, the vineyard that inspired Warren to buy the land and plant SLV, that being Nathan Fay, he was ready to retire, and he sold the Fay vineyard to Stag Leap Wine Cellars. That would have happened in 1986. Subsequently, the vineyard needed to be replanted, and the first vintage then for us to produce a single vineyard wine then from the Fay vineyard would have been in 1990, and that also is the year then that Cask 23 changed then to be a wine that is the finest of the two vineyards together. Next week, we're going to go through Fay, because Fay is a wonderfully complex vineyard. These vineyards are right next to each other, SLV and Fay, but they have a different personality. Fay versus the violets and the darker fruits of SLV, Fay has a more perfumey side to it, more red fruit, berries and cherries. And the tannins in that vineyard are softer, they're more supple. So they wind up being just really a perfect combination of vineyards to be blended together, which is what we do in Cask 23. So Cask 23 today then is a wine that's about complexity. We want you to be able to experience both those characteristics of SLV and of Fay, both aromatically and in terms of flavors when you taste the wine. But Cask 23 is also really a wine that is about intensity. And by intensity, I don't necessarily mean more rigid or more abrasive or more tannic. What I mean by intensity is length. I often think, what is it? What are the things that really make a wine great? I mean, there's so many wines out there and so many different things that you taste and so many things from different regions. And those two characteristics, at least to me, that is what takes a wine from being a really good wine, something that's really interesting, to being something that is really special. Complex wines, what that means very simply is every time you, I can't wait anymore. I got to pour a little bit of this. Oh my God, the cork just broke on me. We'll pour this one first. Every time you stick your nose in the glass, you get different characteristics. So it invites you in, right? First you smell the glass, you smell the wine, and you're like, I get some perfume, but no, there's something else there. I get some cocoa, I get something else. It wants to draw you in to taste the wine again and again. And in terms of length and longevity, that just simply means that when you taste the wine, the flavors, they sit and linger endlessly in your mouth. It makes you want to taste the wine again. Makes you want to come back to it. Makes you want to try it. Those are the two characteristics that, to me, really make a wine special. So Cask 23 today, Cask really starts out in the vineyard. There are special places within Fay and within SLV that year after year produce great wines. They have a special look, the perfect balance between the canopies and the clusters. So those are areas that we've identified as potential blocks for Cask 23 at this time of the year, or what we'll be doing probably in about 3-4 weeks from now, is walking through those blocks and dropping the amount of fruit that are hanging on those vines to just simply 1 cluster per shoot. Lower yields, not in every vintage, but in every vintage, they give a winemaker really the best chance to make a super exciting wine. So we'll go out, and in these blocks, both in Fay and SLV, basically the vines will be reduced to about 1 bottle of wine per vine. So low yield. Of course, we wait until the accountants are on vacation, and then we send everybody out to do this. But that's how we started out in the vineyard. As the grapes then come in, I'm going to vinify every block of grapes from Fay and SLV to be the very best wines that they can be. Obviously, I'm looking for those special blocks as well. After the harvest, then I'll kind of separate out my top 5 or top 6 wines from Fay, top 5 or top 6 wines from SLV. So those wines have to be special on their own, and they have to have the identity of the individual vineyards. I'm not looking for a great wine from Fay that tastes like SLV or vice versa. I'll do some other things to those wines then while they're in barrels for the first 6 months, and then I look to actually do a blend then of those top wines before the next harvest. So right now I'm actually working on Cask 23 from 2019. I like to have the wines then physically put together, and so they're in barrels physically together for an additional year. It's kind of a philosophical thing. You know, I'm Italian, and you know, the sauce always tastes better the next day. And so physically putting the wines together, having them aged together in barrel for that extra year. There's always maybe little things that I'll be looking to tweak here and there in that second year. But then I really know the wine. I really know what I have. I really know what little things I need to do. And right now, actually earlier today, I was finishing or working on the final blends for 2018. So we're getting ready to bottle Cask 18, Fay, and SLV. And the little details are so important in winemaking, especially as we're getting down to the end here. You know, 1%, 1 barrel of this or 1 barrel of that. It really has an impact. So again, going back to why I blend, like to get that blend together in that first year, then I really know what I have and what I can use to focus on till the end. So we've got 2 different vintages, and they're both very different. We pulled a bottle of 1987 and a bottle of 2014, and I think they're actually really perfect wines to pour and taste now because they also again show with the clusters. So 1987. So what was? I'm going to pour a little 14, and grab this little cork out of this guy. Remember, this is the Osso that we used last week. And we'll grab that. Let me grab it out. So the 80s in Napa Valley, in this particular vintage, wow, this is tasting really, really nice. So again, 87, this would have been just the finest wine from SLV. 87 was actually set up a little bit like this vintage here, and that it was a more of a drought season, a warm earlier year in the spring, and then pretty warm temperatures during the summertime as well. The wines had a lot of intensity, very, very low yielding vintage. I showed you the cluster with the from the more water stressed vine. This is what you would have seen looking like out in the vineyards here in 1987. The mid-80s, though, in particular, this was a time when a lot of replanting was happening. There was a grapevine louse called phylloxera that eats at the roots of the vines. That's why all of our vines here are actually planted onto root stocks that are resistant to that. But there was a root stock that was widely planted in the Napa Valley that in the 80s, early 90s, it failed to protect the vines from that phylloxera. And so a lot of the vineyards had to be replanting. So this 87, this is probably one of the last vintages it would have seen from some of the older vines, except that we do have a 1972 planting of SLV up there in Block 4.
I got someone asking, what gives the wine the flavor characteristics you look for in Cask?
Well, again, the flavors I'm looking for in Cask, I'm looking for complexity. And so in both Fay and SLV, they have a distinct personality, right? Last week we talked about SLV. And again, the question, just to repeat the question, is what flavors am I looking for in Cask? So SLV's personality is dusty cocoa powder, it's violets, black currant, it's got more of this, more berries, cherries, a floral character, almost a cinnamon type character. So I'm looking in terms of individual flavors. When I smell a glass of Cask, so just talking aromatics alone, I'm looking for all of those together in that same glass. And then in terms of length, and again, when I'm picking out a wine that I'm going to use for blending into Cask, it really is about the finish. I mean, the finish of the wine and that length, that longevity, that is really key. As I was saying, that to me is what takes a wine from being a great wine to a special wine. So it has to have those flavors on the finish. Those flavors need to linger in my mouth. They need to stay there forever. You know, it's kind of like with a wine like this, you're kind of like riding a surfboard, right? You don't want to be too heavy or too light. You want to ride it like right down the line. If you can ride it right down the line, then that is what really perpetuates that balance, that length, and that longevity in terms of taste and texture. Good question. Now we'll go in to the younger wine now, 2014 cask. So 2014 as a vintage was interesting vintage because it started out being a very, very dry. It was a second year in terms of drought. We had actually set up the vineyard for a drought situation where we had tilled things, and we had actually really, when we pruned really tight. And then of course we wound up getting some rainfall in the spring. So when you had the potential then for things to be grown in a more tighter area, and then we wound up with some rainfall in the spring, then you wind up with berries that look a little bit more like this. So a little bit bigger. Our biggest struggle in 14 then was we had to change gears and try to slow things down. The rest of the growing season in 14 was very, very even, really without a lot of drama. It was a warm season. The wines are very, very aromatic. They're very complex, but in terms of weight, if you were to put this vintage, let's say between like 2013 and then this vintage, you have 2013 where the weather was almost identical in both vintages. 13 though was dry in the beginning. 14 we had some rainfall in the beginning. The 13 wines wind up being very tannic, very rich. The 14 wines are soft, they're silky, they're very, the tannins in 2014 are very, very lush. This will go good with dinner tonight. In terms of the last thing I'll comment about in terms of how we blend with cask is that, again, there really isn't the recipe with this wine. I mean, it tends to be more or less 50-50, but some years it might be a little bit more Fay, some years it might be a little bit more SLV. I thought that there was some kind of a reason. You know, the 2012, which was such a balanced year, was 50-50. 13, which was a tannic year, wound up being a little bit more Fay. 14, this vintage, which wound up being a little bit of a softer vintage, has a little bit more SLV. And then my theory got blown out in 2015, where you had a more tannic year, and then the blend is based on SLV. So again, you can't with winemaking. There's no recipes, and just like in the vineyard, you got to walk the vineyard, then decide what to do based on what you're seeing for that year. And it's the same thing when you're blending or when you're tasting wine as well. You have to see what's in front of you. You have to taste, and that's where you have to make those final decisions.
What are you expecting with the 2019 vintage?
All right. The question is, what are we expecting with 2019? Well, you know, we always are. We're very good at guessing and making and speculating what the vintage is going to be like. You know, so far, what I'm seeing out there is pretty good. Again, we had an earlier bud break. And then we had this like really cool spell for about a month where really not much happened. And then we had some good heat. We had a little bit of crazy weather during bloom, which I think maybe will impact set. And now we're getting warm weather. So, I mean, the vineyard, again, it's because of the drier seasons. I tend to like those types of seasons going in because you do wind up with the ability to get better control over your canopy earlier. I'd rather have grapes that are a little bit smaller, right, in the end, in terms of how I ferment and how I extract those nice lush tannins that we get from here. But so I like what I'm seeing right now. But that being said, it's June 11th, and it's a long growing season. You know, I'm expecting a normal harvest in terms of timing, which means late August, early September for Sauvignon Blanc, early September for Chardonnay. Cab coming in second, third week of September. So we have a pretty long way to go. We have 3 more of these next week with talking about Fay. Then we're going to talk about aging wine. Then we're going to talk about the 17. So I'll give you the update every week, and if I see something that looks funny, but I'm kind of excited right now with what I'm seeing out there.
And then someone else is asking about the 2012 vintage, saying the best he's ever tasted. Do you have anything special about the 2012 vintage?
Well, there's a question about 2012. That 2012 was a great wine, a great vintage. I mean, I agree. I mean, it was you know, we always like to, when we think about vintages and the weather, you know, you remember the vintages that have drama, right? Whether it's good drama or bad drama. 12 was a year that it was just easy, right? It was balanced. There was a good crop, long growing season. It was a recovery from 2011, which was a much more difficult season. The wines just were very, very balanced. I would say in terms of texture, maybe 2014, if I was to think and look back at, let's say, the last 6, 7 vintages, like which one would be the most like 2012, I would say probably 2014 in terms of texture, in that the wines are a little bit softer, they're a little bit silkier, they're smoother, but really wonderfully fruity and wonderfully complex as well. Okay, so last thing I thought, since we are talking about Cask 23, and a cask is, of course, a barrel, is I'd talk briefly about barrels, because without a doubt, I'm not just saying this for our vineyard manager, Kurt Grace, but the grapes are the most important thing. The most important ingredient is how we farm, how we grow the grapes. It's impossible for me to make great wine without great grapes. The second thing in winemaking that's the most important thing is how we ferment. So how we do things in the cellar behind me or in our other cellars, how we ferment, how we extract, our techniques, our attention to detail, how we do our pump overs and things like that. But number 3, without a doubt, is cooperage and barrels. Depending on the type of wood that you're using, it's so important to marry the flavors of your wine with the flavors from the barrels. And barrels and barrel making is a wonderful thing. It's an artisanal, it's an artist thing. I mean, it's so complex. I mean, and so it's so important for me as a winemaker to understand the wood, to taste the wood, to understand what's happening, and then be able to marry the right barrels or right combination barrels with the wines that we're producing. For example, I don't necessarily use the same barrels for Fay, which has those perfumey characters, right, and softer tannins, than I do with a wine like SLV. SLV has a different character, it has a different personality, so I'll choose a different combination of barrels to match with that. But I actually, Ben, if you want to bring it over, I've got a couple barrels out here, and I popped the head off of one, and I thought I'd show you guys a couple things that would make barrels so important. So most of our wood that we purchase is, are all French oak barrels. This barrel, the trees or the forests are highly managed in France. You have to have just the right tree in just the right place. The staves themselves then are cut. This is what a stave would look like. This is actually after it's been bent. But the staves, after they're cut, they're actually allowed to dry outside in the weather for 2, 3, sometimes even 4 years or so before a barrel. So, or how slow the trees grow. And that's why I took this stave off. I don't know, Ben, or if you want to look on the side right here, as you can see the growth rings of the tree. Okay? So I want to show you 2 different staves. If you look to this stave that's right here, you can see the growth rings of the tree. This tree, at least in this span of its life, was growing much more rapidly than, let's say, if you can pan over to this stave over here, and you can see, you almost can't even see how close together these are, right? So this particular stave came from a tree, or might have been the same tree, that was from an area where, or a time period where maybe there wasn't a lot of water, or it wasn't growing as fast. So the point is, if I was to make a barrel, or we were to make, I'm not going to make a barrel, Cooper was to make a barrel out of a stave completely of these type of wood, it is going to taste completely different than a barrel or a wine from a barrel made from staves that look completely like this. The thicker, the slower the trees grow, the faster the flavors of the wood is going to get into the wine, and it's going to have a different taste and a different texture. The slower the trees grow, the flavors get into the wine, as you would expect, at a much slower rate, and they have more density and more power. The other thing that's interesting with barrels then is after they've been brought into the cooperage, in order to get them to bend like this, you can't just do this on its own. You have to heat up the wood in order to bend it. Some folks will use boiling water. Other folks will use fires. And then a light toasting is put on the inside of the barrel. And again, the techniques that coopers use to do this, what they use to do this, a lot of folks will just use like a little, almost looks like a campfire that's made of oak staves. And depending how hot that fire is, how smoky that fire is, how long the barrel is on the fire, it all influences this light caramelization of the inside of the barrel, and that influences the taste of the wood, which again is going to have an impact over the taste of the wine. Just as a comparison, this particular barrel, I would say on the outside here, this is a medium toast. And then if you can look right here, Ben, right next to the side right here, you can see how much darker on this particular barrel that toasting would have been. versus the outside of the barrel here, where this is obviously not toasted at all.
Someone's asking, how do you decide which barrels you use?
The question is, how do I decide which barrels to use? Well, that is a great question, and a lot of it really is based on experience. I mean, some of the coopers that we work with here, I've worked with for 20 years or so. But you do every year, you have to do a trial. You know, what I'll do is I'll take a wine from Fay, a wine from SLV, a wine for Artemis, and with all of the different cooperages that I may use, I'll fill a few barrels of each of the individual coopers that I use, and then I'll let that wine sit in barrels for the entire aging process on its own. When I rack it, I'll rack the wine out and I'll put it right back in the same barrels. And then after whether it's 18 months for Artemis or 22 months for some of our estate wines, then I'll pull samples just from those individual barrels, taste it blind, so that I have an understanding of what the different flavors are of the barrels. Sometimes the cooperages can change, and they certainly will change maybe a little bit depending on the vintage. If I have a more tannic vintage, I tend to use barrels that have a little bit more structure, have a little bit more power. If a year looks like it's going to be more elegant, or a cooler year where Cabernet is going to have maybe a different feel to it, I may then pivot and change a bit the different cooperage selections that I'll use. Maybe I'll use more lighter toasted wood, or a slightly different selection to marry with those flavors. But a lot of it is, I mean, again, it really is experience. It's very important to have a good relationship with your cooper so that they understand your wine and that I understand their wood and their production process, and so to have confidence in the flavors. Because unlike grapes, so during the growing season, you know, I may see things that's happening and we may adjust, and I may have a clue as to how to ferment based on what I'm seeing out in the field or based on what's happening with the weather. With barrels, they are what they are. They come, it's all based on your tasting experience and what the flavors of that particular barrel are. It's a wonderfully complex thing, but also we age in barrels for different reasons. We age both for flavor and then also for texture. You know, as wines age in barrels, whether it be for 18 months, 22 months, they do soften. You'll notice that these barrels there's no glue that holds these things together, right? They're just the staves. So the barrels breathe a bit, and so they breathe a little bit of a slow transmission of oxygen into the wine during the aging process that helps to soften tannin and bring out fruit.
One last question. Someone's asking, is cooperage a vendor that makes barrels?
Is cooperage? Well, a cooperage is a place that makes barrels, yes. A cooper would be a person that makes barrels. A cooperage then would be like the place where the barrels are made. Some coopers, you know, they have names that have cooperage incorporated as part of their name as well. Okay, well, hey, I really appreciate you guys joining me on the journey through our discussion of Cask 23. And I look forward, hopefully, to see you next week, where we will be in the Fay Vineyard talking about Fay. So, cheers, everyone, and have a great night.